Section 1D is NASD and FINRA rules. On the content examination outline, we will still see reference to NASD rules. Someday, FINRA will have a consolidated rule book and do away with all NASD rules, but until then, we still get to learn them. So NASD IM 1000-3, you never have to memorize the actual numbers, but I'll always reference them. Failure to register personnel. If a member firm should have associated persons registered but does not, they can get in trouble for that, which really is common sense. So every once in a while, firms do get in trouble for not properly registering persons that should be registered with FINRA. NASD IM 1000-4 is a very similar rule as it pertains to branch offices and offices of supervisory jurisdiction. So we'll learn more about branch offices and OSJs as we go throughout this section, but there's this idea that broker-dealers register with both the SEC and with FINRA, and the broker-dealer is responsible for notifying FINRA of all branch offices and properly registering them, as well as the offices of supervisory jurisdiction. And if they don't properly designate and register such offices, they can get in trouble for that. NASD Rule 1020 has to do with registration of persons like you, those people that should be registered as principals. 1021, registration requirements. All principals must be registered. So all persons engaged in the investment banking or securities business of a member who are to function as principals shall be registered with FINRA as such. Before your registration can become effective with FINRA, you must pass an exam, which is why you're here. Who is required to be registered as a principal? So the definition includes persons associated with a member who are actively engaged in the management of the member's investment banking or securities business, including supervision, solicitation, conduct of business, or the training of persons associated with a member for any of these functions are designated as principals. So within this NASD rule, such persons include sole proprietors, officers, partners, managers of offices of supervisory jurisdiction, as well as directors of corporations. So right now, I'm betting you have a Series 6, right? You do, or you wouldn't be here. And you've been promoted. The way the FINRA rules, historically NASD rules of course, work is that so long as you're currently a registered rep, you have a limited lines license, your Series 6 mutual funds and variable products license, you are allowed to function for 90 calendar days following a change in your duties as a principal. It's during these 90 calendar days. So this is a nice rule that the NASD has. Granted, NASD and FINRA, of course, are interchangeable nowadays, right? So these are calendar days. So from when you are promoted, basically, given supervisory responsibility, you can begin that right away. But you have to take and pass the Series 26 test within those 90 days. If you don't, you can't function as a principal past those initial 90 days. It's also important to note that if you are not a registered person at all, you can't automatically function in a capacity as a principal, which would make sense. The only people that are given this 90 calendar day window of time are those people like you who are already currently Series 6 licensed. I'm sure there's not one student out there that doesn't already have their Series 6. NASD and FINRA rules require that all member firms, with the exception of sole proprietorships, have at least 2 officers or partners who are registered as principals. So all broker-dealers must have at minimum 2 principals. Must have at minimum 2 registered principals, unless the firm is a sole proprietor, and then of course they would only have to have 1. but most broker-dealers are not sole proprietorships. What kind of principal registration is out there? There's really two that I care about in this context. There's a general securities principals license. That's a Series 24. Or there's what you're doing, which is a limited principal license, which is your Series 26. So NASD Rule 1022 discusses the fact that all broker-dealer firms must have a chief compliance officer. This chief compliance officer, whoever it is notified, FINRA is notified on what's called Schedule A of Form BD. They're usually a Series 7 registered, Series 24 registered principal. So in order to do your Series 24, your general principal's license, you have to have your 7 first. Unless the broker-dealer doesn't engage in the sale of stocks and bonds, then it is perfectly fine for the chief compliance officer to be like you and have a Series 26. So normal broker-dealers, when they do business not only with the sale of variable products and mutual funds, when they actually transact stocks and bonds for their clients or for their own account, then their chief compliance officer has a 24, and you can't get a 24 without your 7. But it's okay to be the chief compliance officer for your firm if your firm only does business in the area of mutual funds and variable products. So that would be okay. It's also true that if you have your Series 24 license, you can supervise people that have their Series 6 license. So let me show you how that works. So when you have your Series 6 license, or when your associated persons that you're supervising have their Series 6 licenses, the principal license normally is a 26. And when the people that you're supervising have their Series 7 license, your principal license is normally a Series 24. But it's also true that the person with a Series 24 General Securities Principal license can also oversee people with their Series 6. But this principal cannot oversee people with their 7s. You probably know that from being in this business, but the rules want to make sure that you are aware of how all that works. So what is this limited principal license? It allows you to oversee investment company and variable contract products. You have to pass the test to be able to do it, but if you have your Series 6, they give you the 90 calendar days in which you can engage in this business without being licensed yet, or without having passed the test yet. It is the requirement of your broker-dealer, the member, to promptly notify FINRA when an individual not previously registered with the member as a principal assumes the duty of a principal. So the idea is, today you, Bob, got promoted to be a principal. You can engage in those activities right away, pass the test within 90 calendar days. The member firm notifies FINRA right away, promptly. NASD Rule 1040 talks about registration of assistant representatives and principals. So there's this category under NASD Rule 1041 called an assistant representative. It's an order processing category of registration. So these persons do take a test. It's called a Series 11. And what they're allowed to do is very limited. Order processing. We don't do that test. It's not a very commonly taken exam. Order processing, Series 11, assistant representatives. So the definition within the NASD rule, any person associated with a member who accepts unsolicited customer orders for submission for execution by the member would need to be, or would have the ability to be, registered as assistant representatives. Order processing, Series 11. If their registration should lapse for any reason, they have 2 years to reapply. without having to retest. So that rule is true whether or not we're talking about Series 26, 24, 7, 6, or Series 11. It's the same rule. So anytime you leave the firm, U5 form is filed, which we'll talk more about momentarily, and you have 2 years to reapply without having to retest. So what is a assistant representative prohibited from doing? An order processing person may not solicit transactions, may not solicit new accounts on behalf of the member, may not render investment advice, make recommendations to customers, or effect transactions in securities on behalf of the member. Persons registered in this category may not be registered concurrently in any other capacity. So this person is not engaged in the sale of securities, is not making recommendations, can only process what kind of orders? Unsolicited, yes, unsolicited orders. So how can we pay someone who's not soliciting transactions? The only way you can pay them is on an hourly wage or a salaried basis. The member firm may not in any way relate their compensation to the number or size of transactions executed for customers. This rule does not prohibit persons registered with a Series 11 license from receiving bonuses or other compensation based on a member's profit-sharing plan. So profit-sharing plans would be fine, but they don't get paid commission is basically what that rule is saying. So how can you compensate an assistant representative? Hourly or salary? The persons at a member firm that are licensed with a Series 11 license must be under the direct supervision of a registered principal. So with your 26, you could oversee not only Series 6, but also Series 11 licensed individuals. NASD Rule 1043 allows for certain people at a member firm to register to be proctors of the firm's in-firm delivery of the regulatory element of continuing education. So this is a unique rule. Now remember, the only things I'm teaching you are things that are on the content outline for this test. So I don't write the content outline. I just teach you what they put on the outline just to make sure that any potential test question, you have the proper information to answer. So remember that. I didn't make this stuff up. So one of the requirements when you have a securities license, your 6, your Series 7, is that you continue to learn. So you have to do the in-firm element of the in-firm element of your continuing education every single year. So there's two different things that go on. So there's this in-firm element, and then there's what's called the regulatory element. So the regulatory element must be completed within 120 days of your second registration anniversary date in every 3 years thereafter. And normally you go down to a testing center. So you go down to a Pearson VUE Center, you go down to a Prometric Center, there's different centers in different parts of the country, and you take a test. However, some bigger broker-dealers will say, we don't want to send our people outside to a testing center. We want to, in-house, deliver the regulatory element. So we're not talking about the firm element. That's a totally different requirement. This is really the ability to proctor the people, the registered reps at the firm that are taking that test in-house. So usually they have a room with computers set up, and then someone at the firm can sit there and watch them take the test, basically. Back in college, I was a proctor for a bunch of tests. Back when tests were on paper and pencil. That's how old I am. So now it's all done on computer, of course. So if someone at the firm wants to be a proctor, now people that are registered can be proctors, that would be fine, but this would be a separate category of registration, and in order to be a proctor, you don't have to be a registered representative, and you don't have to take a test. You just have to let FINRA know who it is that's being a proctor for this in-firm delivery of the regulatory element. So on U4, which is the registration form that is filed with FINRA, it's called Category IF. So Category IF, so on Form U4, Category IF. So Category IF could be selected if someone was getting their Series 6 or 7. They could also be an in-firm proctor. Or this could be someone who is not taking a test at all, but they still do a U4 form, right? FINRA still wants to know who they are. So category IF. A person whose sole registration is as a proctor shall not be qualified to function in any other area that requires registration. So these persons can register as such, but that's all they can do. Registered representatives 6 and 7 can also register with this designation without a test. There are some things that show up on the content outline more than once. So I do my best to only teach things once, although I do sometimes teach it twice if it shows up in an area where I feel like it's going to be really emphasized on the test twice, or if it's the same information but in a totally different rule. So sometimes there's a FINRA rule that says something and then there's an SEC rule that says the same thing, but I still cover it twice. So if you feel like you already know something, great, then you'll know it even better when it comes time to take that test. So applications for registration of broker-dealers. These are some rules under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. So the Securities Exchange Act of 34, I remember it by calling it the People Act. It's the act that requires registration. So the Securities Exchange Act of 34. It's not a test where you have to know what are the rule numbers. It's really not unless I really emphasize it. Like 2111 is suitability, FINRA suitability, I would definitely know that. So this is Rule 15B 1-1. They're never going to ask you that. I would know the Securities Exchange Act is the People Act. It has to do with registration of broker-dealers, registration of registered representatives. So it talks about within this rule, all broker-dealers must register. How do they register? What do they fill out? So BDs must register. What form do they fill out? You know this. Form BD. That's easy. So of course it stands for broker-dealer. Broker-dealers must register. Form BD is filed electronically. How is it filed? Where is it filed? It's filed through the Central Registration Depository, the CRD. So, filed electronically. All the paperwork required for registration, whether or not it's the Form U4, which is your registration paperwork, or it's for the firm, it's all filed electronically. It's all filed through the Central Registration Depository. In the event that the broker-dealer should decide to no longer be a broker-dealer, it would be what's called Form BDW that's filed to withdraw the registration. Form BDW, W stands for withdrawal, is used to withdraw the firm from registration. And then the successor firm is the firm that's really taken over after the other firm no longer exists. So the successor firm is required to register within 30 days after such succession. So the successor firm files their own Form BD. The old firm files Form BDW. Anytime information found on any of these forms filed electronically through the CRD should become inaccurate, the information should be updated right away, promptly, as soon as you can. Withdrawals from registration shall become effective on the 60th day after they've been filed with the SEC, or longer or shorter as the SEC deems necessary for the protection of the public. But generally speaking, forms filed to withdraw registration with the SEC are effective on the 60th day after filing. So Form BDW or Form U5, if it's for an individual, effective on the 60th day. So these forms are filed with the SEC. Now it's true if the SEC is investigating the actions of the firm or of a registered representative, they may withhold the withdrawal of registration for a period of time. Because once the registration is withdrawn, there is a statute of limitations that the SEC has jurisdiction over that formerly registered person. Rule 15b 7-1 basically, in a nutshell, says broker-dealers shall not affect transactions in securities unless all people, natural people associated with the firm that are engaged in the securities business are properly registered. Rule 19H-1 has a really long title. I'm not going to read that to you. If you haven't read the book yet or read the PDFs, please read the PDFs. I certainly do my best to not read to you. Granted, in law, there's sometimes nothing else I can do. But in a nutshell, what this rule is designed to do is sometimes persons have done something in their life that subjects them to what we call statutory disqualification. Generally speaking, an individual subject to statutory disqualification is not someone that a firm would like to employ. However, it is possible that the firm may employ an individual subject to statutory disqualification. And it's this rule under the People Act that sets forth how would a firm go about doing this. Or how would they continue to employ a person who suddenly becomes subject to statutory disqualification? So generally, statutory disqualification would disallow a person from being a registered representative anymore. Reasons why a person would become subject to a statutory disqualification. If the person is enjoined temporarily or permanently from violating the securities laws by a court of competent jurisdiction, if the person is barred or suspended from association with a broker-dealer by the SEC, by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, or by an SRO or foreign equivalent. So SRO stands for Self-Regulatory Organization. FINRA is the SRO over the securities industry here in the U.S. Or another reason for statutory disqualification, if the person has been convicted of any felony or certain misdemeanors within the last 10 years. So this idea of any felony within the last 10 years includes non-securities related felonies as well as obviously securities related felonies. Many people that become subject to statutory disqualification have committed offenses that aren't related to the securities industry. For example, you can have a felony related to driving under the influence, possession or sale of a controlled substance, assault, manslaughter. Under this rule, 19H-1, if the member firm is willing to sponsor such person, so employ such person, they need to make a special application to FINRA for approval. If FINRA approves the employment of this person, then FINRA will submit this to the SEC. One of the factors that the market regulation staff will really be looking at in deciding whether or not this statutory disqualified person should be allowed to be employed with this member firm is who's going to be overseeing this person. What sort of supervisory responsibilities, guidelines, duties has the firm set forth? So it is possible that a firm sponsors a person subject to statutory disqualification under SEC Rule 19H-1. So all that's under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, the People Act. Member firms must have supervisory systems, and one of your jobs is going to be being involved in this supervisory system. So it's NASD Rule 3010, which is the supervision rule. Every FINRA member firm is required to develop, maintain, and adhere to a required supervisory structure, including a written supervisory system, so it's all done in writing, designed to manage the types of business in which the firm engages and the activities of its registered reps, including the designation of registered principals to enforce their procedures. That's you. And the designation of at least one, all member firms must have at least one, what's called OSJ. So Office of Supervisory Jurisdiction. So NASD Rule 3010. This is one I would know. Supervision. So all firms must have a OSJ. Office of Supervisory Jurisdiction, at least one. They must have a written supervision plan. And how many registered reps? Not registered reps, how many principals? A minimum of 2 registered principals, unless the firm is functioning as a sole proprietorship, and then they can have 1. And the principals actually work here at the Office of Supervisory Jurisdiction. So there can be more than 1 OSJ, there just must be a minimum of 1. All member firms tell FINRA where are these offices of supervisory jurisdiction located. So how do we know what's an OSJ? An OSJ is any office at which one or more of the following take place: order, execution, or market making, the structuring of public offerings or private placements, custody of customer funds or securities, approval of new customer accounts. Principals must always approve all new accounts. The review and endorsement of customer orders, that's another one of your jobs, and the approval of advertising and sales literature, another one of your jobs. The OSJ also supervises the firm's branch offices. So who manages the OSJ? A registered principal. So the registered principal is responsible for the activities of all of the registered reps who work at that OSJ, as well as those who work in branch offices under the supervision of the OSJ. So the OSJ might supervise 20 different branch offices. What's a branch office? The definition of a branch office includes any location identified by any means to the public as a location at which the member conducts investment banking or securities business. Except, so these are not branch offices, locations that are used for fewer than 25 securities transactions or fewer than 30 days a year. So maybe you meet with your client at Starbucks. It's not a branch office as long as you don't meet with your customers there every day. If the location is not used for sales, well, then it's not a branch office. Where you live, as long as you're not meeting with your clients, your primary residence, is not a branch office. And locations used only occasionally by appointment. So every once in a while I meet my client at lunch. That's not a branch office. So all branch offices must be registered. So the Form BD is to register the firm. Form BD is to register the firm. So to register the branch office, it's not Form BO. That would be too funny. That would make me laugh. It's a Form BR, Uniform Branch Office Registration Form. I think somebody at FINRA or the NASD must have decided BO was just too weird of a word for it, because that's what I would think it would be. No, it's Form BR. I have teenage boys. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. Lots of teenage boys in my house. So Form BR is used to register branch offices. It's also used to close branch offices as well, or withdraw branch offices. So the OSJ supervises one or more branch offices. There's also something called a non-branch office, such as an insurance agency. Some broker-dealer firms employ registered reps that work at non-branch offices. These non-branch offices are not registered with FINRA as OSJs or as branch offices, which can make proper supervision difficult. However, it's the requirement of all principals to supervise all of the registered representatives, regardless of where they work, whether or not they're at an OSJ, a branch office, or a non-branch location, to make sure that they are in compliance with all state and federal laws, all FINRA rules, all NASD rules, of course. Under the Supervisory Procedure Rule, which of course is NASD Rule 3010, each registered rep and registered principal must, either individually or collectively, no less than annually, have a meeting or an interview conducted by persons designated by the member at which compliance matters relative to the activities of the representative and the principal are discussed. So there's this idea that there is, for all registered reps, so Series 6, Series 7, and all principals. 24, 26, an annual meeting. So we get together at least once a year to make sure that we're doing our job right. At least once a year. The interviewer meeting may occur in conjunction with discussion of other matters, so it doesn't just have to be a review of compliance procedures meeting. May be conducted at a central or regional location, may be conducted at the registered representative or principal's place of business.